All right, today I have my two dear friends. Hello, Maureen and Mike, and they both are educators who have been doing sex education with high school students and thus have received a lot of questions from them about sex and relationships. So we're just going to go through a bunch of them today and answer them for the collective, hoping this can reach other people. High school students, or let's be real, a lot of adults probably also have these questions, and just put that information out there for everyone to have access to. So, kids, do you want to get us started with what burning question you want to answer first?
Sure. So we just have spent like the past couple hours kind of going through all of our questions, which we had kept throughout the semester, and they're like, this is, I don't know, like a tiny fraction of all the questions, but we selected the ones that we thought were most interesting, and even within those, we had to group them because we grouped them into like 6 different categories. So I don't really know which one I want to get started with.
Because I'll give you a second to think, because
Yes.
I was going to say these are all real questions as well,
yes.
from actual human children that have posed these questions. So we didn't load these up ahead of time. And what ages 14 through 18 or 14 through 16?
14 through 16
14 through
probably.
16.
Are these some of your 10th grade questions also?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So all of them are real questions, all but one, which I asked. Because sometimes I will do this thing where, since we answer questions at the beginning of every class, like if I'm just like, the kids have these questions, but they don't want to ask them or something, or like I suspect, or it's just something that I want to talk about, I will put my own question in there and pretend like someone from the class asked it just so that I can answer it. Definitely done that a few times. So yeah, I'll probably answer that one today too.
You should, yeah.
Right, because this is a theme that will come up, but we get asked so many questions about penises. Like, boys think it's really funny as joke questions to be like, is my dick too big? Or like, is my dick too small? Or like, is it normal if pus comes out of my penis? Is it just constantly? But I feel like there are never questions about vaginas, and so I've snuck a few of my own in there just because I want to talk about the vagina in class. But okay, I'll start with this question. So it says, is it really a hormonal factor that guys are more desperate for sex, or is it just justified by society? And I thought this was a really interesting one. I got one that was similar that said, do girls really mature faster than boys? I mean, it's different, but I feel like the cultural expectations that boys are just more immature and more thirsty for sex is like biological, and that they can't help themselves. And so the way that I answered this, and I was pretty proud of it because I was so fired up about this question. So at first I said, I kind of broke it down according to all the arguments that people would give to naturalize the fact that men or boys are more horny than girls, and sort of went through them one by one to disprove them. So the first is that I think people are under the assumption that men have more desire because they have erections, and their erections are more visible, and like, well, obviously, they need to relieve themselves because there's this big, like, well, their penis is standing, like one of the kids said. And so actually women or vaginas also get erections, like clitorises also have erections and get engorged with blood. And actually in when we're fetuses, we have for a long time the same parts between our legs, and then eventually as the fetus matures, but it isn't up until month like 5 or 6, or I may be wrong, but it isn't like until a few months until actually that tissue becomes either a clitoris or a penis. And so like I made a joke by saying, like, basically saying like, oh, next time like girls, like want to hit on guys, they can also be like, hey baby, like I have a boner, because like that actually does happen when your clitoris is engorged. So it's wrong to say that like it's just men or it's just people with penises who have erections. The second one is that clitorises actually have a lot more nerve endings than penises. And so if we're really looking for arguments that, penises want pleasure, or men just have sex for pleasure, that's actually like wrong when you look at like the clitoris, which is also really unique in that it's the only organ that is like only designed for pleasure, and has no other function. And I think it's the only organ within like the men and women, or people with penises, people with vaginas. Like this conversation is going to be kind of binary. But it's the only organ that is designed solely for pleasure. Like it has no reproductive function. When you think of like the nose, you're like, well, the nose also just like smells, really, like is there to smell things, but it's also there to breathe, right? Like it also has a biological function, whereas the clitoris doesn't, and it's really unique in that sense. Then I said like testosterone is often an example, a reason that comes up for like why men are more sexually like hungry than women. And actually testosterone has been known to have like very varying effects the more that we study it. And it's not like only correlated with sexual arousal and aggression, like, and that science has actually really wanted, male-centered science has wanted to naturalize testosterone as the reason for why men are hornier and more aggressive, but that's not actually the case. Like there's a lot of variations apparently for the kind of reactions that it can make in the body. And also if we look at, if we try to look in nature for confirmation bias, like to look at other species and say like, oh, well, we're this way because we're just animals. Like we can just cherry pick the information that we see like in the natural world to justify basically whatever messed up behavior we want to naturalize. Another argument is that like, well, women have like one egg? Women have one egg a month. Whereas men have like sperm, and they just need to like spread their seed all the time. But like if that was true, I was like, yeah, women would only be able to have sex like 1 or 2 days a month, the days when they ovulate. Yet we can have sex all the time. And actually, like I've had sex many times, and not once have I had sex with the intention of procreating. Like we have sex for many other reasons besides procreation. This argument that I think really naturalizes rape culture too, like this idea that just men are more ravenous for sex, and they rape because, and it can be used to legitimize rape as like, oh, well, it's just their survival instinct, like they're trying to spread their seed. But I said like rape is never actually about reproduction. And I made this joke, like it's not like there's a rapist that like approaches a woman and wants to rape her, and then she says like, oh, well, I'm actually on the pill, and he's like, oh, damn it, like I guess I'll come back next time or something. Like it's never with the intent purpose of procreating, so it's like absurd to naturalize it that way. And then kind of going along the same vein of, well, you can find examples in nature of whatever you want to naturalize for humans. Is I gave an example of chimpanzees, where actually the female is usually much hornier, whatever you say for non-human animals, than males, and they can have sex with up to 8 males an hour.
Damn, girl.
So anyway, I liked that fact. But yeah, I said like
with the egg, the 1 egg a month. Can you hear me?
Yes, I'm just gonna open our window because it's very hot.
Okay, I need to close my window at some point, so we'll switch on. I always forget to do that, and then it's so loud. Yeah, I was gonna say that kind of tracks too with like if we were thinking that this was all based on procreation, then like having 1 egg, you think you would just be having sex like the entire time that you're ovulating with as many people as possible to be like, give me the best odds here,
Right.
So yeah, it tracks that like chimpanzees are out here just doing their thing.
Right. And it's also like we would be having sex like 30 days out of the month, or 31, because like we're like, well, I'm only ovulating 1 day a month, like I need to like maximize my chances of getting pregnant.
Yeah.
I agree.
And given that sperm tends to degrade the more you have sex, then you would have to have sex with a lot of different men or penises right. to have the best odds,
Yeah. Definitely. I answered that one with Duncan, who was a teacher in the next room. I always teach like next to a person's office who's very kind, but I'm just like, he must listen to me answering these questions and just, yeah. Anyway.
You're like, well, what is happening?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, and this one I think also relates to the question, like, do girls really mature faster than boys? Because I think that's something we tell high schoolers a lot. It's like when boys act out, kind of girls are supposed to be like the bigger person, because, you know, they have to care for their feelings, but also they, you know, they're in charge of sort of elevating or like making the space like more mature and more serious. And yeah, I was actually with a co-teacher in that room who was like, oh, well, yeah, of course girls mature faster than boys. Like, everyone knows that. And I was like, yeah, I kind of disagree with that. I think that's so linked to our socialization and the fact that, like, as girls, we're raised to always look out for other people's emotions, always try to read other people's emotions, take care of their needs before they even voice them, be quiet, be discreet, like be petite, not take up too much space. Like, I don't think that boys actually mature later than girls. And even this whole idea of like, as if there's a standard for like what maturing means, that, you know what I mean? Like, that's so culturally defined also. Like, what do they mean by maturity?
Yeah, I think it is really important to talk about because there's so much essentialism in how we discuss male behavior in particular. And like you said, I don't think that there's anything biologically that makes boys mature less quickly. So even if they do, it's really a function of socialization, like you said, of them just not having to be accountable for stuff and not having to notice certain things. I was talking about this the other day, but just even like living with a guy, I've had this experience many times where it's like they don't see the housework that needs to be done and they don't see you doing it because they're just used to like these things magically happening around them. So it's like, sure, we could call that immaturity, but it's coming from socialization. It's not like a biological thing where it's like their brains literally can't see dirty dishes, you know?
Right, wait, you weren't born just doing the dishes out of your mother's
Yeah, just come out of the womb like, where's my sponge? Yeah, so I like that, and I do agree with you. I think that's very tied into rape culture, where it's because when you're immature, what are you? You're impulsive, right? You can't control yourself. You are more prone to being susceptible to your base needs, and like, you can't empathize with other people. And these are all really dangerous things to condition all of us to accept from, a certain part of the population.
Yeah.
Well, and so much of that socialization of the way that boys and girls, owners of penises and owners of vaginas, have been conditioned to see sex came out in the types of questions that we received. And, right away it becomes apparent. You read through these questions and that most of these kids have this idea that sex is a penis and a vagina and it's penetration. And that's the definition of what it is. So you get all these questions about like, oh, well, how do I last longer in bed? Or, with the assumption that sex, begins and ends with like the male orgasm or male pleasure. And it was really interesting to see even, some of the people who identify as girls in the class who had already internalized that, at the age of 14, they've already internalized that. What was that question about, like, about do you have to give back? Are you expected to give back when having intercourse or things like that? And so it's just very interesting to see that that this expectation is already, by the time that they're in high school, there's already this expectation about what sex is, and that they can't imagine anything other than just penetrative sex between a penis and a vagina. That's kind of it.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be curious to hear like what answer you gave to the one, like, how do you last longer in bed? But I answered it and I was like, guys, that literally does not matter. You are taught to believe that it matters, and like that's, there could be a whole other conversation with like how we've been conditioned to think that's the most important thing with porn and like even with movies and stuff. But like if sex is not, since sex is not just penetrative, and it doesn't end and begin with the male orgasm, like if you last a minute, that's totally fine. Like focus on the girl's pleasure, and like the fact that like they're so concerned with, and they're so like embarrassed if they can't have an erection or have it for long enough, or even that their penis is too small. Like, again, I understand that because that's how we're socialized to think about sex. But actually, like, if pleasure is the benchmark of like how good a sexual experience is, like that doesn't actually matter. It's like, that's fine if you don't last long, just do something else. Like you can still eat out a pussy, you can still just make out. You can still, there's a million other things you can do.
I remember like saying to them at one point, it's like, this may come as a shock to many of you, but if you're the owner of a penis, you do not need to come to have sex. Like that is not a prerequisite of some kind of sexual interaction happening. You know, and it's like you can see these wheels turning as these kids like, wait, what?
Right.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it's true. That is how you define it. It's penis and vagina, and it's male orgasm, and that's what completes a sexual experience. But yeah, there's like literally countless other things that you can do. And you know, just I really enjoyed when I was first reading up on like how to have a threesome, that in threesomes that are at least, you know, well done, I guess. There's such a, they tell you like there's it kind of happens that way. Like there's no set ending, and there's these phases of people doing different things to each other and taking breaks, and like, you know, there will be making out, and then yeah, there's penetrative sex maybe, and there's all these different unfoldings of how people are engaging with each other that I think is really cool, and just not expected when we think about sex in this very rigid sort of way. And I can't tell you how many times I've been having sex with a guy who's like, don't move, don't talk, you know, because they're like trying to last longer, and it's like, but I'm now like, you just keep stopping and starting, there's no rhythm, like this is not fun for either one of us. You know, so
Right.
just, I love the focus on pleasure, and that was something I was talking to the Raven Corps kids about, is like plpleasure is different from performance, and we should be seeking pleasure and not performance.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's only a problem if you like don't last long or come too fast when you're a guy, when you're the owner of a penis, but like in a hetero, you know, relationship. Like if you think that then that means that the sexual like intercourse is finished. But it's
Exactly.
like, no, as you said, it might come as a surprise, but it doesn't mean that it needs to end, you know, because the concern with like, how do I last longer is really only rooted in the presumption that sex will end the moment that, you know.
Well, and that also that the
orgasm.
penis and vagina penetration is the sex. So yeah, if you can't do that for very long, then you're going to feel like you're bad at sex. But if you understand that sex can be a whole bunch of other things, then like you're saying, it doesn't really matter how long that portion of it lasts, or if that even happens. I think it's interesting to talk about, question, I guess, have you ever brought up sex toys in any of these conversations? Because you find often that cishet dudes are very intimidated by things like dildos and vibrators and toys that could also help with something like that, like not lasting long enough. You could bring a toy into the mix, and now suddenly you're having a really great time. But that's seen as them failing to perform properly, and like it's an insult. So has that ever come up? Has anyone asked any sex toy questions? Or
I got
I'm curious
one.
what kids think about sex toys. You know, are they thinking about sex toys?
I mean, I did get one. Maybe this is tangential to what you just asked, but sort of revealing about just the heteronormativity of the whole culture in general. But a kid asked something about like, why do lesbians have sex with plastic penises? And I remember, you know, I mean, my first reaction was almost to laugh when I read that, because I was like, wow, really? And so, you know, when I answered, I said, well, they don't necessarily, you know, but this goes to this whole expectation that there has to be some kind of a phallus in order for intercourse to happen. But I think that was the extent. I don't think a kid ever asked specifically about sex toys in my class. I don't know if you got one.
I just got one about where do you buy a sex toy or something like that.
Not on Amazon, apparently.
But yeah, and to that question too, it's like the idea that it's just a plastic penis is also really problematic. Like, no, there's so many sex toys that they're shaped like, I mean, they're not the replica of a penis, you know, they're like bright pink, and they don't, of course, some of them are made to like kind of imitate more the like shape and the tip of a penis, but like, I wouldn't say that's the majority.
Well, and I mean, even just to jump off from that, I mean, I had a conversation with some very hetero men recently, and like their knowledge of like how to acquire sex toys, or like even like how to go into a sex shop and ask questions, like they were just like they were scared. And then like once I started talking about it really openly, it was like then they were asking me, like they were just peppering me with questions. And I was like, how can you be, you know, around the age of 40 or so, and like you're like scared to ask these questions? So I think, you know, it's no wonder teenagers are afraid to talk about it. I mean, there are, you know, cis adult men who are just mortified at this idea of discussing sex toys openly with other people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and another interesting stat that I threw in there when they were asking like how do you last longer, just to go back to that question really quickly, is that actually like, and Nick, I feel like you've talked about this on a past episode, or Mexi and I have for sure, but that there's like a big orgasm gap between men and women, but also within like lesbian or like girl on girl like relationships. They're much more like the rates of like having orgasms after in each time you have sex is like above 80 or like 70 or 80%, whereas there's a stat that was published by Durex, I think, and that said that only 4 to 20% of women have, which is also a big, anyway, maybe, I don't know where I read this, but it was between, like the studies showed that between 4 and 20% of women have orgasms from like solely from penetration on a regular basis. So I was like, if you're not lasting long enough, like that really is not a big concern because actually studies show that like that might be something that might be actually really good for your sex life.
Mohira said, I think it's like 90% for lesbian sex. Lesbians have a lot of orgasms, like a lot of orgasms.
I'm sure.
And before we move on, I wanted to pull Mohira said, okay, but if boys mature slower than girls, then shouldn't they look up to women as role models?
Yeah.
And then Latasha said, right, the math ain't mathin'. Women mature faster, but they still have to mansplain things to our stupid little women.
Yeah, that's so true.
Yeah. And Mohira brings up another good point. I don't know if this has ever come up in class, but the idea that like all women want like a giant penis, and that actually women and like people with vaginas, like we're all different shapes on the inside as well. So not, like everyone has different preferences depending on how they're shaped, depending on how they get pleasure. So yeah, I've really hated this. I know for myself, like I've always hated this obsession that people I've dated have had with their size. Cause I'm like, honestly, most sizes are really great for me. Like I actually don't want anything too big, especially if you don't know how to use it. Cause then that's just making more of a mess than usual.
And I do feel like when like boys have huge penises, they maybe like do less research into the other stuff, or they're just like, yeah, like my dick's huge. I don't, like I don't need to do anything else because I can just put that like joystick in a vagina and like the woman's just gonna like erupt in screams and just permanent orgasms, But that's what porn shows you. It's like the second like the guy like slips his peen in there, it's like ecstasy,
Yeah. I know. I
have a lot of feelings about this.
I do too. I had a boyfriend who used to obsessively talk about that all the time, and he would constantly say he wished he could have a vagina for a day or two so he could like sleep with people with penises because he thought it was so amazing. And I was like, it's not that great. I'm like, just the penetration itself is not actually doing a lot necessarily. So like, and I was like, I wish you could too, because then you would come back and like be disappointed and understand. And I mean, he was actually really good in bed, so I'll give him credit for that. But it just showed me like how much men have this idea that exactly like anything like I've been asked questions by boyfriends like, oh, do you have an orgasm every time you use a tampon? And I'm like, no. Like that's not how that works. And I mean, I'm sure someone out there is having an orgasm every time they use a tampon, but for most of us it's just like brushing your teeth. It's just this thing that you do. That's like a chore.
And I feel like I was also told the lie that like, like having a penis in a vagina was just like ecstasy right away. And I remember I got my period like on the late side. I was 16. And I just remember being shocked by like how completely not sexual it feels to like just put something up your vagina, like for me at least. Just because, I mean, that's I feel like the way that like heterosex is presented, it's kind of a legitimate inquiry for men to have. Like, oh, do you have an orgasm every time you put in a tampon, Because like, we're lied to,
We are lied to. Well, those tampons can pop that precious hymen, so something must be happening.
Right. Yeah.
Has that come up? I didn't get to read through because I wonder, that was something that I kind of experienced is I bled a little bit my first time, but not much. And I remember my boyfriend being kind of like, So have the kids ever asked about that, like bleeding during your first time or the hymen or anything around, um, virginity and all of that?
Do you want to take this one?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like you had.
I mean, we'll go tandem here because we had a wealth of questions about this.
The timing one you want?
Well, just about virginity in general. I mean, this kind of like mythical, very odd, socially constructed, like bizarre expectations built around this concept of virginity. And so a lot of the kids, again, it comes down to a language thing. You look at a lot of the phrase "lose it" or "give it up." Is used a lot, and I think that's really telling. Most of those are coming from vagina owners. Those questions, as opposed to the penis owners, and a lot of times too. Again, there's sort of this unspoken expectation that means penetrative sex. That it's like, virginity means this very particular type of sex act. So we had a lot of questions about that. And a lot of that was just about like unpacking what kids mean by that, because you could ask a room of 15 teenagers, what does it mean to be a virgin, and get 15 different answers.
But you wouldn't, though. They would probably.
Or you could not.
But the answers would be the same, don't you think? They would be like, oh, well, what it means to be a virgin if you're a penis owner is that you haven't like stuck it into a vagina.
Right.
And if you're a vagina owner, it's that you haven't had it stuck inside of you.
Yeah, but you get really confused looks when you're like, well, are you a virgin? If you've done oral, are you a virgin? Or if you've done anal, are you a virgin?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, so it's like there's some like nuance depending on the kid.
But I think there's also like so much this.
Yeah. yes, God's loophole.
Yeah. But I think also like religion is huge in constructing that myth of virginity.
Yes.
For like, the control of female sexuality and, but I do think that there's, even though I wouldn't say our school population is particularly religious, but there is that constant fear of like, am I going to regret it when how do I know that it's the right time so that I don't regret it? That was another question. Yeah, that one came out a lot. Well, and that was one, I mean, just on that religion note, because I had a very particular religious upbringing, very conservative, evangelical Christian, going to hell for masturbation type upbringing. And so, for me, a lot of these, I can hear it in a lot of these kids' voices through those questions, a lot of shame around sex. And I think that was another thing that just struck me, is that a lot of kids just carry so much shame and guilt around sex. And it comes out in the fears that you see in their questioning, about regret, for example, but even about the timing, like how do I know when I'm ready to have sex? I mean, that question, I mean, I think I got that at least 6 or 7 times. Yeah. And it's a really hard one to answer, because it's like, how do you know anything in this really fucked up like society where we've been socialized to? Because I think there definitely is a portion of kids who feel like a lot of guilt around, potentially being sexual or not knowing when the right time is. But I think there's also a huge amount of pressure to have sex and like to send nudes, for example, to like have a big ass and like, like, oh my God, we got the question too of like, which is more important, boobs or butt? Let's do a popular vote to the class or something. Yeah. Like, I feel like that's a question that came up a lot. But so it's like when you answer a question, how are you ready to have sex? I mean, to Mike's point, like so much, it's about unpacking that question much more than about giving like a straight answer. And that's what the question box ended up really being. It's like, okay, well, what do we mean by virginity? Or what do we mean by like, how we know when we're ready to have sex, and like what kind of messages have we received, and like what does that mean? And well, it often started with interrogating, let's ask what we're asking when we ask this question, or let's ask what assumptions that we're making by asking this question. Like, why are we using the term give it up or give it away or lose? Let's talk about that a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'd imagine for the guy's end, it's about getting, right? It's about acquiring or winning. you know, there's a lot of verbs that go along with that, like where they're not so much losing something, but they're achieving something. And on the
Mhm.
girls' side, it's about losing something.
Yeah.
And I know I talked about this on a previous stream, but I I really need to shut my window. There's the farmers market happening, so like all of these people are. Anyway,
Do you
I'll
want to
take a
go
second.
shut it?
Yeah, I'll say this and then I'll go shut it. But even though I wasn't raised religious, I really deeply internalized these ideas about purity culture and about how, you know, the first time and the first person was like extremely special. And so I stayed in a relationship that was really abusive in a lot of ways because I felt that I had like that we were each other's first and that had to mean something and that meant that like we had to make it work, you know, because I loved the idea of being able to say, oh, I've only slept with one person my whole life. And that kept me in a situation that wasn't healthy for a really long time. And this is someone who was raised essentially atheist, you know. So it just shows you how much this purity culture and these Puritan values have seeped into the broader culture, that you can even be raised atheist and still yet deeply embody this idea that there's something like really special about being clean and about being pure and about like having a low number. I know I was obsessed with my number for a long time of how many people I'd slept with and thought that that meant something, you know, like every time I added a person to my tally, I was like, yeah, just like, man,
Losing value out here.
yeah, just really racking them up. And then of course, like eventually in my journey, I got to a point where it was like kind of a point of pride, or I just didn't care as much. Like I got over it. But I remember, yeah, for the first, you know, 5 or 6 people, it was like it was a huge deal every time I slept with a new person. And I think this also kind of impacts the way we look at like how a life trajectory is supposed to go, because I've realized now, like I'm still single, and so that means I've slept with like a fair number of people, but I actually don't sleep with very many people like in a year, you know? Like my number is actually quite low if you look at like my yearly average.
It's like we're getting
statistical.
Yeah.
But it's because like I just haven't found someone to like settle down with in some kind of monogamous long-term way. Like I have had monogamous long-term relationships, but I haven't found like my forever person or whatever. And you just kind of realize that that's built in as well. Like that's part of the shame that people feel if they're not married by a certain age, or they break up with someone in their 30s, right? Although that causes a lot of people to have like a crisis. And this is part of how we're conditioned to like settle down with one person and just try to make it work, because otherwise we're somehow damaged and failing. And it was just so illuminating to me in my 30s to be like, I'm old and I'm not married. You know what I mean? It makes sense that I would just have a higher number than I thought I would have in my life. And it just kind of deconstructed that for me and made me see that like this is part of trying to shame women and scare women into settling down with people and being, you know, like pure and just being like, you know, it's all about your biological clock and just all of these things. And just as I got older, I'm like, it's very natural to just sleep with different people. It's very natural to like have these experiences in your life. There's nothing more about sex than there is about any other life experience you have. You know, it's special in its own way, just like a lot of things are special in their own way, but it's really not a bigger deal than anything else that you do.
Mm-hmm.
Like traveling or having friends or, you know, any of these things. Like it's just part of the texture of your life. Okay,
It's
I'm going to
really
shut my window and you talk.
Yeah. Well, was going to seize on one of those comments you made about purity culture and the way that the way that those certain values just are kind of baked into everything around us. And you see it in the way that kids view things. And so even as you said, in maybe what you call a secular culture or a secular school like ours, you know, kids will ask questions like, why do you guys want girls to be virgins but to also be experienced? Like there's this value placed on that. And I think it's interesting. I don't know if we really unpacked this. I mean, I saw this a lot because we had a few Latter-day Saints kids or Mormons in the vernacular. And I was like, right away I could tell when one of them was asking a question, because I was like, yes, these are my people. They're coming from the same fucked up kind of religious background. I'm thinking of one student in particular who's bi, and her family are all Mormons and super disapproving, so she's totally closeted and just had questions all the time. But so much of a lot of those kids are just living under this like umbrella of shame, and it doesn't even have to be religion. It can just be these social expectations, kids asking about regrets and things like that. I think we do construct a lot of that around kids, which is such a shame. Like you said, Nick, it was, in your 30s, you started to kind of like unpack some of that. And it's like, you think of the harm we're doing to teenagers by not letting them ask these questions and not letting them have these conversations. In schools, you run into this thing where people are like, oh, are our kids ready for this? Can we have these conversations? I'm like, we better be having the conversation about what's going to happen if we don't do this,
Yes.
as opposed to the conversation of what's going to happen if we do let kids ask these questions and actually give them real and honest answers.
Yeah. Well, and because also the schools had situations just like every other school, but of like nudes being circulated and like
every year that I've been there, there's been an issue like that came to the surface of a child being shamed really publicly. Is that so?
Yeah.
And that dichotomy of like, there's so much pressure to do certain things, to feel like you're going to be accepted or loved. But then at the same time, if anyone finds out that you've done these things, then you're shamed for it. And I think that ties into that question about why am I supposed to be a virgin and also have experience, because nudes are like that. Like, I, as an adult, get so much pressure to send nudes, and I'm a cranky old piece of shit. So I'm like, go fuck yourself. I don't want to. But like, as a teenager, I remember how much pressure I felt at every moment of dating, until I dated my ex, who is really sweet and like did not pressure me about stuff. But everyone else I dated, it was just, I remember like, you would go to a movie and you just be like waiting, like, when's the hand gonna be on my boob or in between my legs, or like what, like what's gonna happen. And it's like this constant feeling of having to have your guard up, and also having at every moment to decide, am I going to try to impress this person by letting them do what they're trying to do? Or am I going to try to stay like a good girl and not do it? And also in all of that, how the fuck do I even feel about it? Like, it's so hard to even know what you genuinely want to do, especially for me being autistic. That adds another layer of like, it's really hard. A lot of us need time to process and know how we feel. It's hard for us to feel things, like know how we feel in the moment. So all of that, I just remember being so paralyzed. So many times things would happen to my body and I would be like, I don't know what to do right now. And just stuff that was wildly inappropriate too. Like, I remember I dated this guy, and he brought his friend over to my house while I was babysitting my sister. And we were like cuddling on the couch, and he was trying to like finger me while his friend and my little sister were like right there. And it, you know what I mean? And it's like, but like as a teenager, I just was like trying to like gently push his hand away, but not make a scene and not make him feel rejected, but also like definitely was not something I wanted to have happen. And just being so hyper aware of my little sister and not wanting her to see that. And it just was such an experience of that all the time. It's like, you have this thing that you're supposed to guard, and then you're supposed to like make this massive decision of the one person who gets to have it, and you're like a fucking kid. It's like, I can't carry all of this.
Yeah. And I think also like the one thing that you're supposed to guard, but also the one thing, like, especially because men are framed as having like these impulses that they can't control, and like your duty is kind of to like satisfy that and to help relieve them. Right. Being like, I'm also gonna get like added value if I do like, quote unquote, give this up, or if I do like, I mean, there's just no right way to act. But for me, when I was a teenager, I think that one thing that was super, super present, I didn't grow up in a religious background like at all. And I feel like I felt like a tremendous amount of pressure to like be sexually active and like do stuff. And I remember, it was like always like, who is going to still be a virgin? Like when they get back to school next semester, like after summer, and like, and wanting to lose my virginity and like wanting to have like sexual experience, and like everyone kind of asks each other, and you have to like, I just remember feeling like so much pressure, and I think these kids feel a lot of pressure in that way too. And that just like led me to like accept things, to do things that like when I look back on them now, I'm like, yeah, I just like really see it as like very unconsensual or like really messed up things that happened. But at the same time, I think at the time I got like a lot of validation and didn't see it as fucked up, because I was like, you know, this person is, you know, this man is older, or this man is like good looking and he's horny, and he's, you know, I'm like doing the right thing. I'm doing like the kind thing and also the like valuable thing of like providing that service for him. And then never dissociating that from, like, never being able to check in and be like, wait, but like, did I enjoy that? Like, that wasn't even relevant. Like, I feel like I was like, yeah, that was like super fun. And then I look back on that and I'm like, was it though? That was like terrible. Like, that wasn't fun.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, it just does make it really tricky, that question, like, when do you know when you're ready to have sex? It's like, when do you know anything? When you receive like that many messages?
Well, then,
Yeah.
I mean, on top of that, you have the kids who are with a partner who like they feel the obligation too.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like we had a lot of kids asking questions about like, how do I tell somebody no without hurting their feelings?
Okay, that was like my next category. I don't know if we're like ready to move on to that.
Yeah, let's get into it.
But there were so many questions that, like, honestly, 9 times out of 10, I can tell if it's a girl or a boy that asked it. Like, and I don't think it's totally problematic for me to say that, in that, like, I'm pretty sure I'm correct. There's obviously some where I'm like, oh, you know, I don't know. But there's just a whole set of questions that I put under a category, but there's like 15 questions. But it's essentially like girls asking how they can turn down boys without like hurting their feelings. So, you know, the questions are, is it not nice to fake an orgasm? I was like, that is their concern, that it like wouldn't be kind of them, you know? How do you break up without being mean? How do you reject someone without being rude? How can you make it clear that you don't give consent without being rude or awkward?
Mm-hmm.
How do you become friends with a guy without him getting the wrong impression? Is it normal for women to feel like they owe their dates sexually for kindness? If your partner really wants to have sex or get head, but you don't, what should you answer? If you want to impress someone, but you don't want to look stupid and don't want them to think you want to have sex, just a relationship like boyfriend and girlfriend, what do you do? Yeah, all those questions just to me fall under the umbrella of like women being socialized with this expectation that they need to always be pleasant. They never need to like ruffle feathers. They can't be mean. Like, what's worse than being like mean as a woman and unpleasant and like unkind to boys who are also helpless and less mature and just can't control their desire to have sex, you know? And I mean, the one especially, like, how do I make it clear that how do I say that I don't give consent without being rude or mean? I was like, if you're with a partner who isn't checking in to like that you're giving consent, because consent should be this active thing that you opt into, not something that you have to like opt out of at the last second if you don't want to do it. Yeah, like the person should be checking in with you, but also if you don't give consent, like if you're not in an unsafe situation, it's so like, don't worry about being rude. You know, like the person will get over you being rude, and the person is an asshole if they make you feel bad about it. But also like it's much harder to get over an experience that you force yourself to do because you don't give consent than to like the fact that we're equating women's violation of consent with like men's hurt feelings is always. And it starts like so early, you know?
Yeah. No, it starts extremely early. I remember being told as a young child, being picked on by some boys, that they liked me and that they couldn't help it, and then them physically hurting me was a sign of their affection.
That's like, something you hear when you're like 2 or 3 years old.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like, we teach little kids this kind of stuff.
It's like, oh, it's so cute that he keeps like pinching that girl and chasing her down the street. He likes her. It's like,
yeah. I think I remember that from kindergarten. Yeah, like some boy pulling my hair constantly, and just that's what I was told is like, oh, he must have a crush on you. And that was it. No one did anything about it. I was just told to like withstand this physical pain because someone had romantic feelings for me that he was translating into physical abuse. And
Right.
that was normalized.
Yeah.
Yikes. And it just continues, and it just morphs, and it follows you your whole life, that kind of logic.
Yeah.
That, this idea that like having any kind of being drawn to a woman in any sort of way makes a man weak, and his method of coping with that usually presents itself in some kind of abusive way, whether physically or
Right.
otherwise, right? Like it's even normalized for men and boys to pull away in a relationship or to ghost or to do all these things because either they got what they wanted and so they're gone, or they're scared of their feelings. But it's like that's a
Right.
really shitty way to treat someone else, especially someone else who's trying to process the fact that they made a decision to do a thing with you, and
Mm-hmm.
now you're just gone. And I wish we talked to kids more about how to, like, there's nothing wrong with casual sex and casual romantic or sexual encounters, but like how to do that in a way that's ethical and that takes the other person's humanity into consideration. And I think when we frame
Right.
this whole thing as like this game, and yeah, we're teaching girls that standing up for themselves or having boundaries or having demands is rude and makes them like crazy or clingy, then no wonder we end up with adults who are doing the same damn thing.
Yeah. Yep. Very well
And then you
said.
settle for like nothing because you'll settle for the first person who like sticks around, or you develop this really warped sense of like what kind, like this question of like, do you owe your date like sexual acts for kindness? And I watch a lot of like dating reality TV shows because I am trash, and it's amazing in a sad way to see how many adults like will label something kindness when it's like not even the most basic thing someone could do to just be a human to another human.
Yeah.
Or Hillary and I joke about this all the time, but it's like people would be like, oh my god, we just had such a deep conversation, and the conversation was like, I love my family, I also love my family, and they're like, wow, that's like the deepest conversation I've ever had. And I'm just like, what is going on? Like, people are not talking to each other. And this sense of
Right.
emotional
Are you quoting
intimacy.
Love is Blind?
Yes.
I totally remember that this conversation when they got out of the room and they're like, wow.
They're
We
like,
just
oh my god.
connected on so many deep levels. And it's like you literally both share that like you both have a dog and a mom and a
Yeah.
dad.
Yeah.
And like you want to have a family later on. They're like, we want the same things. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm so happy that you knew that. It just feels
I'm just like, what are you guys talking about the rest of the time? Like the fact that this is
Right.
enough of a conversation for you to be like, yes, I want to marry this person. Because like, damn, that was deep. Yeah. I'm trash too.
I love it. It's why we're friends.
It is. Yeah.
So do you have anything in general that you say to the kids when they ask this kind of category of questions? And how do you address, because you're addressing the whole class when you answer this, so I assume you kind of address it to the girls, again, just being binary about things, but do you say anything that's kind of addressing the boys as well?
Well, we have a whole unit on consent. So if it's after that unit, it's always really helpful to refer back to it and we talk about like different models of consent. And by the way, this is not our curriculum. This is a curriculum called Unhushed.
Mm-hmm.
And it's based out of Houston. It's like a small, Austin. Yeah. And it's basically like comprehensive sex ed in a facilitated way. So it's really more centered around conversation than just saying like, as you say, like teaching kids how to put condoms on cucumbers or, how, like just how anatomy works. But so, I can refer back to that, as in like, it's always, no one owes, also like this feeling, I think I do talk about my point of view as a woman a lot. Like you don't owe anything as a woman. And we're trained in like so many ways to think about denying, I don't even like this phrase, but like denying men sexual pleasure as like the worst or meanest thing that we could do. This project, one of the questions that I wrote into my question box was, is blue balls real? Because I feel like that was such a thing when I was a teenager. Like, well, for men, it's going to be like so painful and they're going to have blue balls. And, like, it's just like mean to lead someone on, right? This whole idea of, oh, you make them believe that you're going to have sex and then don't complain if then you get raped, right? Because you brought this person back to your place or something. Or like, well, you aroused them so much that they couldn't help themselves. And I just really stress over and over again that like blue balls are not a thing, that they are not, that like it's such bullshit that men like can't control their like impulsiveness because they have this like physically absolutely like tortuous experience of having an erection, and that there's, I don't know, I feel like I'm not doing the best job of like answering the question right now, but I think I like a combination of like all those factors that I talked about, I just like stress over and over again. And I think it's helpful for at least like young women to realize that like the culturally sanctioned response when you, or unfortunately like the expected cultural response you're going to get when you put down boundaries and like don't, and like expect consent is like male aggression or male like them trying to guilt trip you, or and that men are also socialized to react in that way. So I think just knowing that like that's what you can expect, and it doesn't mean that you're like a horrible person who has done something wrong, but that is just how like gender norms are designed to operate, can be really empowering too.
Yeah, I think it can be really important to talk about how someone having boundaries for their own body is not inherently a reflection of you, their attraction to you, their feelings for you, or your performance. Because this is another thing that well into adulthood I've experienced, of just something basic like trying to give some either requesting something or trying to give some instructions in bed during sex turns into someone moping or ignoring what I'm asking because they're interpreting that as a failure on their part instead of just saying, oh, this is just something this person wants for their body. This is not a reflection of me. But that's what we're taught, right? Like that's part of it for boys. That's why with the boys, you don't get questions like, how do I make my girlfriend feel loved? How do I make my girlfriend feel safe? Right? It's like, how do I don't even know what they ask. Whatever it is they ask.
How do I get head? We did get one question that was
how do I know if my girlfriend is enjoying our sexual activity? Yeah,
which is good, but even that's
what
still
an
kind of
enlightened young
centered.
man.
I mean, it's one step on the way towards enlightenment, maybe the first, but
yeah. Or there's a lot of questions around consent, but they're question like you get so much fear from boys and men about what if someone regrets it after? What if it was consensual, but now she's saying it wasn't? Or things along that line where it's like you can tell there's more fear about having consequences after than there is about really understanding how to connect and how to like have a safe experience. Because they're not really asking about like safety. They're asking like, how do I not get called out for this thing that is scary to all men are terrified of being accused of doing whatever. Like we hear that all the time. And anyway, it like has followed me, and I'm sure a lot of other people throughout my life, that this idea, and women do this too, and that's why I think it's important for everyone does this, or can do this to a certain degree, but we just interpret boundaries as rejection, but they're not. Boundaries are just communication, and they can be actually an invitation to deeper connection and deeper pleasure and deeper intimacy if they can be respected. So, any young people listening and any old people listening, like, I think that's a really important thing to internalize. And it took me a while. Like, I know as an insecure person that if my boyfriend had boundaries of any kind, I did take that as a rejection, and I would mope, and I would do all the things that now I can see are emotionally manipulative. And we've talked about like consent for boys too, and like helping boys to understand their own desires, their own boundaries, things they like and things they don't like, and being able to safely communicate that to their female partners, because that doesn't always happen. There's guys who don't like certain things, but if they try to assert that boundary, the woman flips out because she thinks she's being rejected. instead of being like, oh, good, like, I want to make you feel safe too. And I want us to have an environment here where we both can have these boundaries.
Yeah.
I think that, and it's, what you're saying about consent, it's interesting what lessons kids have internalized, because, when you're working in a school, you start to see what the kids do with all these terms that adults throw around. So, a lot of these kids have heard now the term consent for a long time, but they've internalized consent probably because of the way it's been presented by adults as like a contractual thing,
Yeah.
as opposed to as a conversation. And I love what you just said, Nick, about it's like consent is like opening the door to a deeper connection. It's not signing a contract to get an agreement to do something to someone. It's engaging in this conversation. And one of the things I love about the curriculum that we're using, another plug for the unhushed sex ed curriculum, is they talk about different models of consent that and they give a bunch of different analogies that you can use for better understanding it, to get kids out of this mindset of this sort of contractualized agreement, between two people, and turning it into a part of a really, loving, intimate relationship. And it's interesting to see that a lot of the kids, with the questions they ask, they almost separate sex and relationships, or sex and intimacy, completely. So it's always, that it gives them this sort of perception of what consent is. And I think there's just so much freedom in them looking at consent. That the kids kind of sense that there's a freedom in looking at it as like, oh, okay, yeah, this isn't a contractual agreement. Like, this is a conversation, and I can change my mind, and I can be okay with something today and not with it tomorrow, and that it evolves.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've had that experience as an adult. I was like, I like to call it my mild sexual assault a couple years ago. And I knew that this guy was not going to be safe because he kept joking about having me sign a contract that, like, we worked together. So we were at a conference together, and I ended up bringing him a coffee one day to his hotel room, and he's like, oh, should I have you sign a contract that you like are consenting to be in my hotel room and that everything's consensual? And I knew, I was like, this is a red flag, but I was feeling a little self-destructive. So anyway, things transpired as they did, but it's true. Like, even this idea can persist even into adulthood, that consent is this trap, right? It's this way for women to ruin men or trick men or whatever it is, or to have regrets after and then get back at someone because they have regrets for what they agreed to do. And it does feel very binary. It's like, you gave consent, so whatever happened after, like, you consented to it. And yeah, I think just the more that we can promote that it's really a constant, it's more than an action. It's part of the environment, right? Like, it's an element in the environment that's this constant dynamic thing that should be present in everything that you're doing, whether explicitly or not. And that's something I've tried to start talking to the kids about, is that consent isn't as clear cut as we make it out to be. So, there's some base level consent that you can have, but there's a lot of ways for that to change in a given situation. And what we really need is the safety and the ability to constantly communicate and stop something if it doesn't feel right, or maybe we still do something and then afterwards we have some feelings about it, and to have the space to talk about, like, hey, I know I consented to that and I didn't say anything during, but like, I'm kind of feeling weird about it, can we talk about that? We make consent, I think part of why it feels so contractual to so many people is because we really center it around this carceral mindset of like, did an illegal bad thing happen or not? Right. Did a thing happen where someone's life can be ruined, or is someone overreacting? And that's kind of how we filter these things, instead of saying, okay, someone had feelings, let's talk about those feelings, and not really worry about anything else, and just make it very safe for people to process during and after an encounter.
Yeah, that makes me think of their consent model of like, consent is like pizza.
Yeah,
and it's just, we watch this talk about how like consent is like ordering a pizza and discussing with their partner like what they feel like having on top. And like, you can also do like half and half, or you can like stop while you're having some pizza because you're like, I'm done with this half of the pizza and maybe I want a little bit of this, or like, I don't know. It's pretty well done video.
I was partial to the consent castle.
Oh yeah,
building consent castles, because it was very like it was very generative. It was this thing of like, you're constructing something together. And sometimes you remodel a room, or sometimes you close off a whole corridor for a while, And that sometimes people get a little bit hurt, in the process. Like you talked about, like, hey, I consented to that, but I don't feel good about it. And then you have a conversation. I love anything that makes it just a really generative thing that people do together. Where it's something we're doing together as opposed to something that one person is the gatekeeper and the other,
Right.
the other is the pursuer or whatever. I'm not good with analogies here, but
No.
Yeah, I like that.
Nick, do you want to answer some of the gender ones?
I was thinking that, yeah, we could do some of that. So we have quite a few questions under gender identity. So is it rude to mistake someone's pronouns by accident when they already told you and you're still adjusting? If someone questions your transgender friend's choices of being trans, are you entitled to stand up for them, he, she? I don't know if this makes sense, but is there a difference between identifying as different genders and being gender fluid? If someone goes by multiple pronouns, how often or when should I switch between pronouns for them? So there's a lot of like very sophisticated questions in here. I was very impressed with all of this. But I want to start. So I think people's pronouns are, and this is what I was kind of talking to the Ravencore kids about in terms of, I just did a presentation where one of the things we explored, it was titled queerness kind of broadly, but the angle I took, the angle I took on, it's like, I'm glad you're happy, but like, chill out. The angle I took on the presentation was like doing a very queer anarchist presentation. So it was looking at identity as a border and how, on one hand, identities and labels can be very emancipatory, they can be very liberatory, they can be very empowering, but on the other hand, we only have these labels because they're a reaction to the oppressive structures around us that require us to identify in a different way from what the societal norms are considered. So when it comes to pronouns, the reason I'm bringing this up is because my own exploration of pronouns and some of the other queer people I've talked to around their own exploration of their own pronouns is that pronouns are also a label. So in a certain way, they can be very liberatory and empowering, but in another way, they can also feel like a category, like you're having to choose a way to identify and a way to have people identify you. And I think that's why you're seeing this prevalence of people now choosing multiple pronouns, because for a lot of us, and that's why I do she, they, because for a lot of us, it's like, I don't know, like things shift for me a lot and I don't necessarily feel like I really belong in one particular category. So, I'll start with, if you see someone who uses multiple pronouns, I think the best thing to do is to ask them what they prefer, or if there's any particular way, because for some people, especially those who may identify as sexually gender fluid, or I'm forgetting, there's a couple other labels, but they're ones that sort of indicate a shifting gender identity, then they may want a different pronoun depending on how they feel that day. So for them, it might be good to work out like, okay, should I take cues from how you're dressed, or should I just wait for you to tell me, or do you want me to use they, them until you indicate that day what pronoun you want? It can be different for everyone. So I think the best thing to do is just ask the person what they prefer. I know for me, she is totally fine, but I like when I see that people use they, them as a way to acknowledge my queerness, because I don't really identify with any particular pronoun. I don't identify with any of them. So I use she because I know that's what people think I am anyway, and I use they, them to kind of indicate that I'm queer, and that works for me. So I don't get mad if someone only ever uses she, her, but when I see people use they, them, I feel like they're making an effort to acknowledge my queerness, and I think that's really cool. So that's how I feel about mine, but someone else may feel completely differently about theirs. I know a lot of people who have now started putting they, them first because they actually, that is what they kind of more want people to use, and they notice that people don't use it because it's less comfortable for people. So yeah, I think, and it's something that for a lot of us can be a difficult question. Like I kind of struggle with when people ask me what my pronouns are, because I'm like, I don't really know, like I use these ones because they make sense, but Yeah, it can be like I know a few people who are like, I hate talking about pronouns because I do not understand my own gender. I don't know how to identify. I wish I didn't have to talk about it at all. Like I wish there wasn't these
Mm.
constructs in the first place that require me to answer these questions, you know? And then there's other people who love their pronouns. Like for them, their pronouns make them feel amazing when people use the right ones, and they're so empowering and wonderful. So I think it's just such a personal thing that it's just really important to ask, you know. And if you just see, like for someone like me, if you see something listed and you don't have a direct relationship with that person, then you know, just use whichever one feels comfortable to you, and until some point at which that you might be able to ask the person directly what they want. um I think the you know, if it's rude to make a mistake about someone's pronouns, I don't think that it's rude. I think maybe the most constructive way to talk about it is it could be potentially triggering, but it's also understandable to make a mistake with someone's pronouns. I am queer as fuck, and I fuck up people's pronouns all the time because I'm also neurodivergent and chronically ill, and I have a bad memory. And there's a million reasons why you might struggle with someone's pronouns that have nothing to do with you being a bigot or a bad person, right? The best you can do is to acknowledge it and correct it and move on. But just acknowledge it. Don't like grovel. Don't make a huge deal out of it. Just be like, oh, right.
I'm so sorry.
Exactly. Yeah. Just correct yourself. Be like, oh, him or they or whatever the situation is. And then just move on. And just do your best, you know. But yeah, I think we've done ourselves as a community a lot of disservice in so many ways of the way we talk about things in the mainstream. And I think one of the mistakes that we've made as a community is saying that it's not hard to use people's pronouns, because it is actually hard. What we forget with that is that before we had this awareness of different gender identities, pronouns were not something you had to actively think about, and now they are. And now what we're being trained to do is to not take our visual cues to be able to categorize a person, right? And I don't think for people maybe who don't struggle with different cognitive issues that I don't know that people understand like how taxing that actually is for a lot of us. A lot of us rely on things like being able to quickly categorize, like, oh, that's a woman, that's a man, like I know what pronouns to use and I don't have to actively think about it. Whereas now it's like I have to memorize everyone's pronouns and I can't use visual cues to do that, right? Like I can't, if someone uses they them, I can't say, oh, that person's dressed femininely, so it must be she her. So you lose the ability to have these cues that help prompt you of what the right response is. And when you struggle with cognitive function, like executive function and different things, that makes engaging in these situations really difficult. And I think we need to be able to be honest about that, because not being honest about it is really ableist, frankly. And it also creates this unnecessary tension between communities where you're being categorized as a bad person for making a mistake, you know, or just having trouble with your cognitive abilities to do something. And yeah, sure, there's a lot of bigots out there that do it on purpose. That's legitimate, right? And that is something to be upset about, and that is very rude. But for someone who's making an honest mistake, like I just think the narrative that it's like so easy to use the right pronouns, even saying it's so easy to use they them, it's not. You know, it's not the way we've been trained to talk. But it doesn't mean that it's wrong. You know, it means that we need
Right.
grammar is a tool of the oppressor. And so I actually love they them because I feel like it's a very queer, it's a way to queer grammar. Like it is grammatically correct in a queer context, right? It's queer grammar. And so it is grammatically correct, but we have to, it's a new way of speaking for a lot of us, and you have to learn that, just like learning any other new language or new construct. So I think like we all need to make more space to recognize how complicated something like pronouns can be in many different ways, and make the room to be able to talk about that and work on that together as, you know, like the queer community, but also just in community with everyone else. That's all I have
Yeah,
to say.
I love it. Yeah, I love everything that you said. And I also find it really distressing when I get the sense from adults and from kids that like the way to not, like the most important thing in life to be is not rude, and like to get the language right and to not ever mess up, or like if you can just say the right thing. Like, I mean, we talk about this so much in like dismantling white supremacy and like sexism also, like patriarchy also, but like this idea that like if you have the right language, then automatically like you're an ally or you performed in the right way. So like, you're untouchable. And it's like, no, that question, it's not about, is it rude? Like, I understand that like they've been taught to think about it that way, like that the worst thing in the world could be is to be rude. But really, I think what that person would want to know and would want you to acknowledge is that like you see them, like you want to see them for like who they are, and you believe whatever gender identity they have. And that it might, yes, you might make a mistake of like at the beginning every once in a while, but it doesn't mean that, I don't know, you can still communicate to them that like you really do see them and you want to see them for who they are, and like it isn't just about performing like the correct pronoun, because quite frankly, you can use the right pronoun but still be really transphobic or still, or I think, and I think this fear of like being rude sometimes keeps people from like inquiring further or from like actually understanding like what does it mean to have a gender that is different than the sex you were assigned at birth. And yeah, but I think like in the social justice like context, I mean, we see it a lot in like the diversity, equity, and inclusion work that's done at our school. Like I think a lot of people just feel that, oh, they need to use the exact right language all the time and they need to like respond in the right way, and it's just more about that than actually doing any sort of like work to uproot these oppressive systems.
And that vibe is what keeps trans people, non-binary people, gender non-conforming people as an oddity and not like a person, right? Because you just think, oh, I have to like say the right thing,
dance around that person.
And like you were saying, you're not engaging meaningfully with their identity. You're not actually engaging meaningfully with them as a full human being. You're just trying to say the right thing to not be like canceled or to not feel like a bad person, and then you're just disengaging from that person and not building a connection.
And it's all about you. And like, I mean, to some extent, it's like this purity culture in a different way. Like, it's not about sex, but it is about just being like a good person, right? And to be seen as like one of the one who's like really trying or who's really woke or whatever. But I agree. I think that a lot of like the substance, the potential like connection that could be made between people is like lost sometimes in this context where people think that, and I like what you said about like the person being an odd, like becoming an oddity. If you're just like, oh, right, well, this person uses they, them pronoun. Okay, so like I'm gonna try to minimize my engagement with them if I think that pronoun is difficult. And then I'm also just gonna maybe like rehearse the 3 or 4 things I need to say to them with like they, them pronouns. And then if I fuck up, I'm gonna make it all about like my mistake and how, how that makes me seem, or, and then I might even go see my colleagues and be like, oh, I made like this horrible mistake, but like not bother learning anything about what they, them means, and like all the context that you were giving to, I love what you said about like, it's a way of like queering grammar. Like people get so upset when they think it's not grammatically correct. I'm like, what the fuck does that even mean? Like grammar is a construct. Like it's a very obviously constructed thing that like humans came up with. So.
Yes, I love attacking grammar. It's like my favorite fucking thing. Anyone who's a grammar snob, I'm just like, I'm coming for you, because I just feel like it's such an oppressive structure. And so I as much as I can say, sure, using they, them pronouns even for myself sometimes is like a little tricky, because it's not in a lot of respects it's not natural or inherent to how we speak. I fucking love it because it's challenging this idea of there being one gold standard for language, because almost every language on the planet, is structured in a way to continually oppress people, right? There's a lot of, like in English, there's a lot of the way that the language is structured is built to inherently be like capitalist and imperialist and ableist and all, very binary and all these other things. So I think, anytime we can push back on that and create a new norm that shows that actually grammar should be a loose and very fluid thing that just allows us to communicate with each other, but doesn't have really these like rigid set rules. Because grammar was created it was another way to distinguish class and race. It was another way to say, oh, who's had this education and who knows the rules and can follow them. So yeah, anytime we can disrupt that, I think that's really powerful. So yeah, I think like that can help too, if you can see they them pronouns as this act of resistance and as this active way of disrupting this oppressive structure, this like institutionalization of things like cis sexism, then maybe that can help you, get through the awkwardness that you might feel using them. And I also think what you're saying too, towards like really engaging meaningfully with someone about what their pronouns mean to them, just from a neuroscience, like neuroscience of learning perspective, that can help you form kind of hooks to be able to remember someone's pronouns more easily, because now you have more context and you have more of a foundation, and when you see them or when you talk about them and pull them up in your mind, you're going to have this background of why their pronouns are that way. So it's not just rote memorization, but you actually have some like conceptual understanding for why they choose that. And
it's just such a good point.
Yeah, it's just such a good practice anyway. It's cool to learn about other people, and I think that's another way that minoritized groups are dehumanized, is to think that we're all a monolith. Like every person who uses they them pronouns is doing it for the same reason or has the same gender identity. But you will never find, I don't think ever, two they them people who have anywhere near the same gender identity or gender story. We all interpret this in much different ways. And so I think opening yourself up to like what a kaleidoscope the community is really important, in both humanizing someone and also in understanding, like you were saying, I think then even if you still make a mistake, you're going to be able to root your interactions with that person in a deeper understanding of where they're coming from, and be able to treat them with more respect and validate that, even if you make a mistake around something like a pronoun.
Yeah, absolutely.
I did want to quickly say the difference between identifying as different genders and being gender fluid. I would feel like I'd want to ask more questions about that, but I do think that it's, for kids, it's probably really empowering to know that there's like an endless list of gender identities out there and that you can change them at any time. Because like gender fluid, again, for people who identify as gender fluid, it can mean a lot of different things to different people. So I think just looking into what labels are out there, how people tend to define them, and then experimenting with them for yourself can be really helpful. Like I know for me, I went from non-binary to genderqueer to now I think I might be agender. And that's been like a whole journey, so I think getting away from the idea, as much, like, I think that's why a lot of people like gender fluid, because you're not quite committing to a particular gender identity. You're saying like, it changes, it's fluid, it changes. I think, the more that we can understand that for a lot of people, sexuality and gender are probably going to change over time. The way we talk about it will change over time, and pronouns might change over time. A lot of this stuff is in flux, and again, it's because most of it is us trying to define ourselves against a norm that we didn't agree to. So instead of being able to just be humans doing human things, we have to like label the stuff that we do and feel, and so that will likely be in flux for a very long time, and that is normal, and that if you get shit from other people for that, that's about them, and that's about them upholding the status quo. That's not about you not knowing yourself or being wrong about your identity. You're just figuring it out. And a lot of us are figuring it out. It's very common for people to be literally figuring stuff out for decades. It's not something you typically figure out in a month or two and then that's it forever. It's something that changes over time.
Yeah. I always think about something that Christopher Sebastian said on the Vegan Vanguard when Mexi interviewed him, but he was talking about like trans people and the fact that like many like, conservatives are now really up in arms about like, well, like men are going to use like the women's bathroom and women's are going to use the men's bathroom. And like, I mean, they're usually way more concerned with the former, but it's, this is such a, this is the end of civilization. And And he was like, the thing is that like those people need to understand, like these people have been out here. They've been going to the bathroom one way or another, like the entire time, you know, like they've been using your bathrooms. Like you have been in a bathroom with a trans person, like whether you're living now and we're talking about it or whether you were living like 30 years ago. And like to some extent, I feel like that relates to what you were saying about like they, them and gender queer and like all these different pronouns. It's like, these people didn't just like pop out of nowhere and now are shifting their gender identity in new ways or like to come out as something that they weren't before. Like these people have existed all along the gender spectrum, like since the beginning of humans, and that now there's a tiny bit more room for like for you to use a pronoun that you weren't like assigned at birth. But I think even with the they them, I mean, I think it's kind of funny this like as you're saying, like this desire to like categorize everyone who's using they them pronouns as like just a third gender instead of just like oh, they're existing outside of this binary, and so there's much more outside of this binary than just like this 1/3 category.
That's like it drives me bonkers how often I hear the phrase like girls, boys, and everyone in between, and I'm like, I'm not in between. Like I'm outside of, or I just don't even recognize any of this. Like it's I agree with you. You do get the sense quite often that it's like men, women, and a third gender, and that's it. And it's like, no, there's literally like an endless list of possibilities. For people who even recognize like gender at all, which I'm basically on the end that I essentially don't. So, amongst people who even recognize gender, there's, this endless amount. And then it just becomes this joke too in mainstream culture of like all these identities, the sheer number of them kind of disproves their validity, instead of disproving the validity of like a cisgender.
The only two we use. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. Exactly. Like, how many is it true that there's 74 genders on Facebook now? And like, what if I identify as
a vegetable?
A helicopter. Yeah,
exactly. Helicopter. And it's funny because like I'm part of a Facebook group where I think it's called like What's My Gender or something like that. But we all just post ridiculous things and we're like, this is my gender, or is this my gender? Because like that's the thing too. There's a lot of complexity between like in-group discussions about things and then how we present things to the larger populace. So when a bunch of queers are together, we're just like, this gender bullshit, like we know it's a bunch of bullshit. But then when we're presenting to the outside world, it's like we have to fight for these identities that we've adopted. So we have to like validate it. So it's just really interesting having that push and pull a lot of the time.
Yeah.
Where you get behind closed doors and you're like, this is, and I'm not saying gender is bullshit, like people's identities are bullshit, but I mean, you like see inside yourself how much confusion and conflict you have. Because again, you're trying to define yourself against something that you just don't, that like isn't a real thing. So there's there's a lot of like conflicts that you have where, sexuality too, where you're like, all right, I guess I'll use this label because it's the closest thing I know, but really I just want to walk around and like who I like. I don't really, it's like you just kind of know that the whole thing is a farce. And so it's interesting. And so I think the more you can engage with people just on how they feel, and what's important to them, that's the most important thing. And yes, doing stuff like trying really hard to get people's pronouns right isn't really important, but far more important is to humanize those people, have relationships with those people, and like really talk to them about why they have these labels and how they feel and what their journey's been like and what their lived experience is like. That's far more important than just it's far more important than just getting a pronoun right and moving on and not ever engaging more deeply. We'll quickly answer, is it possible for someone to be 100% cis and straight? The answer is no. Moving on. I do. I could talk about that for a long time, but I want to check in with you too because we're at an hour and a half and I know it's late where you are. Okay, so before we end, I forgot to plug this at the beginning because I'm not professional. But you two have a workshop coming up. So for any facilitators, educators, etc. in the audience, do you want to tell everyone a little bit about the workshop and when it's going to be and where to get more information?
Sure. So the workshop is going to be on July 5th, 6th, and 7th, and it's 90 minutes a day in the afternoon, so 4:30 to 6 p.m. French time. And it's not exactly related to, I mean, it's not the same as what we discussed today. It's not specific to sex ed, but it's more specific to just facilitation and how to have dialogues in the classroom and how to guide conversation, how to like respond to comments, connect them, steer them in a way that like makes the conversation progress, but also makes the students build more meaningful relationships with each other. And then also like day 3 is just a lot about prepping students for discomfort and cognitive dissonance and dislodging dominant narratives and some of the strategies that we found useful to do that. And yeah, Nick and Mexi will be there.
Yeah,
also.
I'm so excited.
So yeah, it's going to be great. And we've worked really hard on it. So, oh yes, and for more information, you can email Nick.
Yeah,
Yes.
just reach out to me on whatever platform and I can get you a link to the flyer. I think that's what you're sending out to people. Yeah. Which will have information about how to register. So
Absolutely. And
highly
there is a
recommend
cost.
it.
There is a cost to the workshop, but we're like really committed to making it accessible for anyone who wants to join. And so it's on a sliding scale. And if you really want to participate, but you can't pay, that's okay.
We just really want to connect with you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Oh, I love that. All right. So yeah, again, anyone who's interested in that workshop, send me a message on whatever platform and I will get you connected to that. I want to thank you two so much for being here today. This was amazing, as I knew it would be. And then I'm going to play our little outro video, so you'll have a couple minutes if you want to go to the bathroom or do anything, and we'll be back for the after party. Enjoyed today's live stream replay? Come join the after party. Go to patreon.com/pinkspots to get access to the after party playlist, where my guests and I continue the conversation in a more relaxed atmosphere. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe. Make sure to click that bell for notifications so you never miss a thing. Leave a comment below, and if you're not sure what to say, then just leave your favorite emoji. This keeps my evil overlord, the YouTube algorithm, well-fed and happy. Thanks to my Patreon supporters, your donations help this disabled queer anarchist live a self-directed life, and that is pretty damn cool. If you can't afford Patreon, or you just want another connection to the Pink Spots community, join us over on Discord, link in the description box below. Alright, Pinkos, see you on the next one.